Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Vanessa Theme Ament, and this is Holy Foley. And I'm so thrilled to have Larry Benjamin, re-recording mixer in television. Larry comes from many years of working in television. He's done television shows such as Better Call Saul, Ozark, Good Wife, A Million Little Things, Charmed, and Seventh Heaven, along with a plethora of a lot of other television shows and movies. And so many that Larry and I go back all the way back to the 1990s when we worked together. He's been a delight and a solid professional. I'm thrilled to be talking to someone who I think you're going to really enjoy. Hi, Larry.
Hi, Vanessa. That's quite an introduction. Thank you very much. I hope I can live up to that.
And the first thing we worked on together was the show Savannah.
Correct. Yes. Taking place on a riverboat often, and the surroundings in Atlanta, Georgia. And that was a show for Spelling Television at the time. Correct.
Yes, and do you know I ended up living in Savannah for a year and then
Interesting.
got my PhD in Atlanta.
Wow, and it's quite a growing community. Back then, it wasn't known for what it is now. Most of the Marvel projects and large feature films are done. Matter of fact, Ozark was shot in Atlanta. A lot of great incentives for production to be there.
Yes, and I recently did an interview with Greg Crawford, who does a ton of ADR outside
Yeah, he's
right
terrific.
in Atlanta.
Sure.
A
Yeah.
wonderful interview. What a delightful man. Well, you are also delightful. So let's get started. You are from Massachusetts.
Correct. I grew up north shore of Boston, about 20 minutes to the north of Boston, and I went to Emerson College and studied film, television, mass communications is what my degree is in, BS in mass communications. And I worked a lot in audio, playing with sound for a little local comedy group called This Is Pathetic, and that was the name of the group. And my job was to cut together at the time on quarter-inch audio tape all the various bits, and I would mix the bits in my dorm room, and I had a little corner which had some sound foam and microphones, and I would record the group in a semicircle, much like you would do a live radio theater play. And we used not only sound effects records, and I mean records at the time in CD, as well as creating performative sound, doing kind of ad hoc Foley at the time. And so that was kind of an introduction into a little bit of audio. Also did radio, both as an on-air personality and doing some productions, editing of promos, trailers, jingles, things like that. And I've been in a lot of bands, so I also play keyboard. So coming from a musical background. So you put that all in a big stew pot, and that kind of ignites my interest in audio.
I am now remembering that you played keyboard because in between we talk about music.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
So, and then moved out of the Boston area when I couldn't find work there. It's a very small community for doing what we do, and came with a one-way plane ticket to California. And worked my way up, kind of starting in the tape library and seeing what was involved. And that was kind of an introduction to seeing what the different departments did. And I really thought I was headed
Where
towards
were
video.
you? Where did you start?
I was at Pacific Video, which was the
So you
predecessor.
started there.
I did, yeah. I was a runner first for Dick Clark, and they did a lot of shows that posted over at Pacific Video. And once that production job ended, I said, "Hey, do you guys have any positions?" "Sure, we got a starting position in the tape vault," and that was my job, setting up sessions. And I would hang around in my free time the sweetening studio, and I was really fascinated and captivated with what audio sweetening was. And it was just kind of a one-person mix situation where you do a little bit of everything. But that really kind of is where I got the bug bitten for doing audio. And I've always had a proclivity towards audio. I remember the most impactful film, it's very cliche to say, but I was a kid when I saw Empire Strikes Back in the theater, and to hear Ben Burtt's amazing work
Yeah.
and all of that, I was really delighted. I knew that it was dubbed in. I knew that it was not, created obviously on the set, but I loved it. And I kind of kept that in the back of my mind. So even though I was kind of video centric, I always had a bend towards audio.
I think I want to stop and just tell everybody now. I met Larry in 1996 or 7 at Laser Pacific,
Right.
that facility. And it had a film lab and it had a sound facility. And there's a really important lesson here for anybody listening who is new to or wants to be in the industry. One of the reasons Larry was there and got moved up, bumped up, and got so many opportunities is because Larry is absolutely one of the nicest people I have ever known in this industry. I started in 1980 and I worked with so many people. and a lot of different kinds of people. And you are absolutely one of the more wonderful people I have ever worked with.
You're very kind for saying that, Vanessa. Thank you. I
But it's
appreciate
true. And I'm saying this because what people need to understand is we tolerate a lot of different kinds of personalities in the industry and a lot of creatives. And I enjoy a lot of different kinds of people. I started out as a singer with Shirley Jones when I was right out of high school.
it. Well,
And I love all the different kinds of people in the industry. And we have no trouble tolerating tons of different kinds of personalities. But if you really want to have a long career in the industry, you need to learn how to get along with people. And it says a lot when someone sticks around at the same place for a very long time. It means he gets along with people.
thank you. Yeah, absolutely true. That is kind of one of the things that I always say to people when I speak to young people. Don't be a jerk and be a cool hang. And that really is a lot of what the job is. Yes, we have to know how to do our craft. It's kind of presumed at the level that we're at in terms of being in Los Angeles, being in a renowned facility. We have to be good at the competent part of the job, but it's these soft skills, how we manage personalities and people, and it is as much as kind of a skill in psychology and a little bit of very good listening skills, communication skills, interpretation, and reading body language and reading facial expressions and things like that, knowing when, okay, now is it a light enough atmosphere to make a jovial comment, or are we just kind of down to business being serious? So all those kind of little nuances are as important as the actual job at hand.
And I also think, as a woman, I had to be more assertive in order to, because it's all male dominated, it still is. I had to assert myself a lot because a lot of men were not easy to deal with. But it's reading the room and being empathic and being
Yes.
sensitive and not being a diva and not being entitled.
You were always great. I loved your humility and kindness. You were always great with me, and it was always a wonderful interaction that you and I would have. And you would, it was very rare to have the Foley stage right across from the mixing stage, the
Yeah,
recording stage. So we had some great interactions, and we could talk about what the craft is that we're doing. Since I was mixing the Foley, you were telling me kind of the processes, and I was very impressed because it's such a creative and imaginative world that is very different. Even though the technology, and we can touch on that, how it's changed, and I've seen it since I've known you, go from kind of analog to where you had kind of components of
yeah.
physical machines and boxes to do what we do to now everything's kind of in a plug-in world and digitally manipulated control surfaces versus analog consoles. But all while that has happened, the performance art and artistry of doing what you do has still remained the same, right? It's still your imagination. It's still what will make that sound, what will be the best way, and it's still the
Yeah.
best, most efficient way of doing it. Versus, I was always worried that it was going to go the way of, at the time, the Synclavier was the big
Oh, yes. Remember when we
example.
thought that was going to be the end all?
Yes,
Or
where
Fairlight or yeah,
yes, where people would map across sounds, it's still way less efficient than doing it in a very humanistic way that you do, kind of
yeah.
performing it essentially. So that is one aspect. The medium that we use to record to certainly has changed, but the process for you is probably more similar than what I'm doing, right? Where that the expectations have changed over the years, the amount of time that we have, the resources, and that's something we can talk about. Doing a network show, we were only given 2 days to mix, and now it's unheard of, generally speaking, on the shows that we work on for the streamers. We get 3, 4, 5 days, and if it's an incredibly busy show, it's almost like a small film. Uh,
Yes, so I want to hear about that. So I'm looking at, like, I'm thinking about when you were working on The Good Wife, that was probably a little more traditional because it was a weekly show.
It was a weekly show. We did 22, sometimes 23 a year, and it was a 2 day mix. So primarily our focus was to, as my editorial partner Nick Forshager said, get it up on the screen in a day. So that was our job, is to kind of work through it, building the foundation of the sound pieces. And then more finesse would happen on the second day, where we would bring in the clients, doing an executive producer. But first we do an internal playback. So let's play it for ourselves. Let's see if the wet paint that we got through very quickly has dried, and if it's a presentable, kind of form. And then we would tweak it and make adjustments for ourselves, for the editor, the picture editor, and then we would bring in the executive producers and showrunners. And that whole experience would have to happen within the course of 2 days. So it's a very quick process. The show, such as Ozark, I have 3 days, really to do it all buttoned up. So that's maybe a day and a half to get it on the screen, half a day of internal playbacks, and the entire third day would be an executive producer playback, let's say with Jason Bateman, with Chris Mundy, the showrunner, and then others in the afternoon from Netflix and MRC, the production company. So it's a more compact schedule than a feature film, but less compact than a traditional network show. And I'm working on a show right now for Apple that's 5 days. So it isn't necessarily more time to mix. It's a little bit more time to mix, but the bulk of the time is really more for internal playbacks, executive producer playbacks, Apple weighing in, and kind of further finessing and building a more polished mix with each pass. So the foundation is built within an early portion of the mix schedule, but the rest of the time is more finessing and more polishing and kind of like detailing an automobile.
So do you get, so I want to say this in a sensitive way. Do you get interference which frustrates your process from the feedback, say from Apple, or is it useful feedback that you get?
Apple is kind of the last stop, and they have the fewest fixes, so they don't get in the way at all. And I will say my experience has been the same with Netflix. They're generally things like, "Can we dig out that line? I'm not hearing that," and they're very few, maybe 6 to 10 notes in the course of an hour show. So surprisingly, Apple is not an interfering partner. It's more the showrunners might have a different opinion than some of the executive producers, and that is kind of part of the job that we talk about, is managing the room. So how can we appease all the various parties? And that's kind of what you have to define early on, is everybody has a voice, right? But it's almost like a benevolent dictatorship. Who is the person that we really need to kind of focus on? And we have to have one
Mhm.
unified voice. So it's really a matter of managing the various personalities to achieve what we want. Because if we have an executive producer who has a particular style, and they want the music to be bombastic, and then maybe the showrunner who is tasked with having that title of running the whole operation wants a little more subtle approach, I try to appease in a very nice diplomatic way, saying, well, maybe let's try feathering in the cue, and then we can go to a place where it's a little bit more driving here. So that way, it's not watered down, but it can appeal to both parties. And I will say, overwhelmingly, maturity is shown on the mixing stage, and we do see things like, you know what, that's a hill I'm not willing to die on, or I'm going to stand down, and you feel more strongly about this, I defer to you, and
Okay, I
that's
want to interject something here. I want to inject a couple of components from my experience of having worked so much in features and an experience I had with you because you were generous enough to allow me to come in at Laser Pacific and see what you were doing on the dub stage. That's the story first. So I want our audience to know that you were mixing effects, and then you went to what we call the big chair, which is the dialogue mixer, and the dialogue mixer runs the dub stage, and that's because dialogue leads. So when I was at Laser Pacific, I've always been curious about what the people other than me do on a show. And you at Laser Pacific were generous enough to let me come in and see what you were doing on the dub stage. And I was always very grateful because I didn't want to just know what I did. I wanted to know, and I always knew what they did on ADR because I did ADR and because I was allowed to go in and see. But I wanted to see what you did on the dub stage. And I remember there was the big screen and then there was the TV. There was the monitor. And you were mixing for both. You'd say, well, we're mixing for big screen, but then we'd play it through, what is it going to sound like on the TV? And I remember going, oh, huh. And that was a revelation because the stages I've been on over at Warner Hollywood, now The Lot, or Sony or Warner Brothers, it was features, and I hadn't seen that. I just see, and I'd been there when they print mastered, but that was for a different ratio. I had not noticed anybody, oh, for TV, they have to think about what it's going to be like going through a smaller screen. And this is before we get the big fancy sound systems.
right.
So now it's a whole different thing. And this is where my experience seeing all the dubs through features, now you're mixing for sound systems in homes. And now we have a problem because you have streaming systems that are going through, you have streaming systems and apps, and you have Apple and you have Netflix and you have Hulu and you have Paramount. You have all these systems going through everybody's home television. with bars and Atmos and all of their stuff. And we get them at home, and it doesn't sound like what you think. And you are trying to problem solve a problem that you don't know what it's going to sound like anymore because it's not going through the TV that's standardized anymore. And it gets to us. And now we have to adjust all the things through our sound bars or through our speakers. And I want to just throw things and hit the TV. And I've got 5 TVs with different screens. And I'm an expert, but I'm not a techie. So, how does all that work?
That's a great question. It's actually very topical. Netflix actually sent me to Southeast Asia to put a presentation together on this very subject. This is a very big problem, what you described, because you're right. Back in the day, when I was playing it back through a monitor, ironically, TV sound, while it didn't have the fidelity that we have now in terms of the signal to noise ratio, in terms of the frequency response, the speaker itself had some heft to it. It was buried in a box and it had some resonance. Ironically, with the advent of flat screen televisions, the speakers have essentially gone away. So if you have a soundbar, that's great. If you have a home Atmos system, great. But we're serving many masters. We're hearing it on headphones, Apple AirPod Maxes, Beats, which have their own little frequency response,
Oh, the
earpods,
phone.
uh, the phone, the tablet, yeah, exactly, the laptop. So this is what I would say. And the reason they sent me to Southeast Asia is the issue that they're struggling with is dialogue intelligibility. So I'm very, very conscious and conscientious about making sure that the dialogue doesn't get buried and swallowed up by the music and the effects. And that's one of the tricky things that you have. You've witnessed a lot of feature mixing, and features sound fantastic when played back in the proper exhibition location. So be it a theater, or at least a decent home theater system. It's really meant for being played back at 85 decibels with moving large amounts of air. Now you put that same very dynamic mix on a small television set without a sound bar, you're now remixing it at home with the remote control up and down for the music. So we mitigate that in a few different ways. I obviously allow the creatives to have their say and let's push the music, but I kind of will push back in a very nice way, diplomatically, of course. I will say, you know what? You guys are very familiar with the script, you're very familiar with the story. We may have even a little bit of confirmation bias, right? So the
Right.
viewer at home only has one shot to hear this important story information. We don't want to bury it with a music cue, or we don't want to bury it with a sound effect that obfuscates that. So let's focus on clarity. And that's one of the things I really, if I do my job right, you shouldn't have to remix the show with the remote control. You should set it at a baseline volume, and that should suffice so that there are dynamics, certainly for music to kind of envelop us, and same thing with the sonic footprint of effects and backgrounds. But the dialogue really has to be the baseline. That is, the dialogue is king and the music is queen. The dialogue is the story. So I mix it at a level that is appropriate, by 79 decibels, 81 decibels, depending on the spec, if it's Amazon, Netflix, Apple, what have you. But dialogue intelligibility is one of the most important things for us to achieve. And then in terms of how do we make sure that that balance plays back on all these systems? Well, obviously we can't break the laws of physics. So gigantic JBL cinema arrays are going to sound wonderful. We do the bulk of listening in that environment to make sure that I can hear intrusions in the track, from a generator or a rumble or, traffic or whatever hash noise. When you put it down to a laptop speaker, a lot of those problems go away and you hear just the dialogue. You don't hear the subtleties. So what we'll do is we'll spot check. I mixed a show for Hulu where the showrunner didn't have a lot of experience listening on a dub stage. So we spot checked using Clearview, kind of streaming to a laptop, streaming to a soundbar, streaming to a Bluetooth speaker. And if you do your job right, if you make dialogue the most important thing in terms of where it sits in the mix, then the relative balance should be the same. Obviously, the music isn't going to have as much heft and low end on a laptop speaker, right? Obviously, it's a tiny little speaker, so we can't break the laws of physics, but if you have a decent sound system, the balance should primarily be the same. So I'm spot checking on small speakers. Back in the day, it was Ortones. Then it became in the music world, of course, NS10s, the Yamaha NS10s with a white cone. We have similar speakers like that, but we will check on an actual soundbar, or we'll use bookshelf speakers to see, is dialogue still intelligible? Are we in danger of pushing it? And I will caution clients, if we mix a music cue that I feel like might be on the edge. I said, let's just do a little spot check. Let's hear this on the smalls. And usually music tends to get smaller, effects tend to get smaller, the smaller speaker you go, and that's when they worry they're going to lose impact. So I caution them, let's not press it too much. Let's err on the side of where people can hear the story and still get the impact. So one of the things that I lobby for, as well as when I say intelligibility, it isn't just volume, it isn't just level,
No,
it's
clarity,
clarity, it's
specificity,
specificity.
crispness, and
Exactly. So it's
articulation.
there you go, articulation. So it's not being overly aggressive with the sound reduction tools. So noise reduction, we want to reduce, not remove, because the human ear is really quite adept at adjusting to consistent sound. If you have a noise like the highway or the freeway, you can turn that down using noise reduction. But if you eliminate it, then it sounds unnatural. It sounds
Right.
distal, it sounds disembodied. So my goal is to reduce it. So if I do my job right, you won't need the subtitles and you won't need the remote control. And it should track and play back because I've mixed it in a not overly dynamic range listening environment and monitoring volume. You can hear it on a variety of sources and it will translate. If it's overly dynamic, that's like trying to listen to classical music while you're in your car on the highway at 65. It just
Right.
doesn't,
With
it's
bad
not,
tires.
right, very noisy. So that's my approach to that. And like I said, I was tasked with presenting this information and my techniques and workflow to the Southeast Asian audience or mixers, technicians and artists because they were struggling with that. That's been an issue.
I was talking with Midge Costin um, in the last episode, and she's at USC, and we were talking about dialogue editing. And I talked about how so many people don't understand the importance of dialogue editing and they don't even know what it is. And they don't understand that it's production sound editing, and you don't clean it, you smooth it out so that you don't notice disruption. And that when you clean it, you are making it sound like ADR and you're getting rid of things. You don't want to do that. You want to smooth it so that the ear adjusts and that you make the dialogue crisp and that the dialogue mixer is your best friend and the dialogue editor is your best friend. And we talked a lot about this because film students and sound students in film don't understand. They just want to play with tools and they want lots of loud music and lots of loud sound effects. And it's like, hold the phone and hold my beer. Don't. You need to think about production sound and you need to think about how to smooth it out and even it out so you get your best production sound first with your dialogue editor.
It's all story, and everything else is in service of that story. The backgrounds, the effects, the Foley, of course, the music, score or source or needle drops or whatever it is. It's all in service of the story. It all has to have some reason. Uh, I'm not saying you can't put something in just because it's cool, but if it overtakes the story, and if you're struggling to hear the story, if you don't understand the story, those are just elements. Those are just like we have tools that help me mix something, be it a console or a compressor or a de-esser. We have tools. Those are tools to help us tell that story.
So there's a really important philosophical thing here. We know that the ear gets tired,
Right.
and
Ear
we
fatigue.
know that mixers say, let's play this back in the morning when our ears aren't tired. I remember that happened a lot. When we were doing features, they'd say, okay, our ears are tired. Let's play this in the morning and see if we feel the same about it in the morning before we send the reel off.
Hmm.
And and so do you have that luxury with the work you're doing?
Yeah, generally we do in that obviously we have a compressed time schedule, but if we're working on our shows aren't nonstop, wall-to-wall action. There's usually big set pieces that occur as well as some kind of interstitial dialogue in between. So it's not all kind of bombast the entire way, the way you would have like an action adventure film or something like that. We have episodes that are like that. And in those cases, you're quite right. Ear fatigue is a real thing. The ear will go into compression. Like if you keep hearing loud sounds like gunshots, beyond tinnitus being a problem and a threat, you're not making good judgment calls. It becomes a point of diminishing return. So pushing
Mhm.
through beyond 9, 10, 12 hours, you're not making good decisions sonically. And because your ears are tired, things are going to start sounding kind of brash and abrasive. So it is best to, you know what, let's wrap this and let's hear it on fresh ears in the morning, or we'll revisit that. If you kind of take the loud scenes and play them first thing in the morning on fresh ears, it's going to get a better representation of the tired ears at the end of the day where you're just fatigued and you just want to get through it. You know what I'm saying? So poor decisions can be made if you just keep trying to do 3 days of work within 2 long days. And that sometimes happens. If you need to do overtime, it's always better to buy another day, not just because of the financial aspect of it, but fresh ears. Just like I noticed first thing in the morning, my ears haven't warmed up yet, so I tend to kind of mix a little bit softer, and by the afternoon, they're fully warmed up, and you tend to kind of mix things a little bit more on the not aggressive side, but just you're used to hearing audio through speakers, moving air, and so
Wait,
that
wait, that's interesting. I want to explore that a little bit. You just said something really interesting that I haven't heard somebody say before. And I'm trying to think how that relates to me on a Foley stage or when I'm in a recording session singing. So your ears haven't warmed up.
right. So you've had however many hours to sleep and not hear audio being subjected, assuming you take a break from earphones, earpods, no audio, just while you're sleeping. And you wake up in the morning, and you've seen this happen even in the car. Here's a great example. You're listening to a song that you love, right? You go into the store, you come back in, you put the car back on, and the song is playing, and it seems unbelievably loud. Your ears have adjusted to not hearing that music. Am I right? You're like, oh my God, who is in here? A crazy person? But it was you listening to that song at that volume.
Yes.
So that similar recalibration happens overnight. You come in, fresh ears, not having heard, the reinvention of the Vietnam War scene, happening in a movie for 9 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, what have you, you've rested your ears. So the judgment calls that you made, what you thought were smart and important to us during the long tired hours in the morning aren't going to be those sound kind of decisions, pun intended. So I would say when I say your ears have to warm up in the morning, you haven't been bombarded and saturated with sound. So even in on the way into work, I'll listen to music at a very modest level, but just to get used to hearing audio, because invariably what I pre-dub on the first day of the mix without any music. I don't pre-dub with music. I'm just pre-dubbing the dialogue, working through kind of working the equalization and notching and noise reduction. All of those things are happening kind of solo without music. When I marry up with my effects mixing partner and put in backgrounds and effects and music, that's when we'll notice, oh my goodness, in the morning I was more, I would say, modest with levels. I was more conservative mixing levels. And by the afternoon, I'm warmed up. I'm now probably a couple of decibels louder. Your ears get used to it. And it's that same example of you briefly taking a break from listening to loud music that you heard in your car. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? The recalibration.
I think the way I would put it with me, since I'm an auditory and physical learner, and I think the way I would relate it to myself if I were to put it myself on the Foley stage is I would say the first cues of the day, the first half hour to hour, I'm more mentally thinking about the cues. And after an hour, I'm feeling the cues.
Right. So it's that same kind of thing where you become one with the process, right? It's no longer
I'm
the
walking it
mechanic.
without thinking about it. I'm
Yeah.
automatically going from what pit to the other. I'm automatically doing the paper with Maurice. I'm doing the props with Maurice. I'm, getting the rhythm of I'm picking the shoes. It's interesting. And this is an interesting concept that you're talking about. I've never heard a mixer talk like this, although they may do it without realizing it. But you are very self-aware of your process,
Thank you.
and this is an interesting thing to think about. There's only two of you in the mixing stage now, right?
Right, that's one of the changes that occurred. We went from a three-person mix crew to two, probably in the early 2000s, I would say that
Yeah.
that happened. They're obviously in feature films when you have a large amount of tracks, larger amount of tracks, not that we don't have a large amount of tracks, but larger, we'll often have a scoring mixer dedicated to handling, strictly the music. But in television, yeah, I'm handling dialogue, ADR
Yeah, but
group, and
even
music.
even in features now, it's usually just two.
Yeah,
And New
that's
York, of course, has only had one forever.
right. And by the way, that's how it is in Southeast Asia. It's one mixer for everything, feature films, for television. Now, the time allotment is a lot more because
A lot
one
more.
person.
New York is that way too. Dick
Yeah.
Forsythe started the one mixer rule in New
Hmm.
York, and they get more time. and it's one mixer, and that one mixer, the one mixer in New York, and this is I write about it in Divergent Tracks, my book about the way the whole style of sound design and mixing and the styles and the approach is different from the Bay Area, LA, and New York. And the way we went from analog to digital and the tools that were picked, because it was three different types of digital when they were picked, and the aesthetics of the movies and the approach to the styles and everything were different. The one mixer style was Dick Voracek. He started it. In New York, it's the mixer that pretty much decides everything. And the sound effects editors are beholden to the mixer,
Right.
which is why Skip Leesay decided to be the first one to go digital. And that's in my book. He did not like walking in and having to be beholden to the mixer.
Hmm.
So he decided, he and Eugene Geary, that if they went digital, they could go in with everything already prepared and go, here you are. And the mixer would have fewer choices.
Right,
That's
right. So
why he
people
went
baked in.
to digital first. And so New York went digital before we did in LA. Now, there was some digital in television, like at TAV, and Eugene actually went to TAV and learned digital.
Hmm.
But um, that's why New York got there before we did, because Skip said, I'm not having any of that. He wanted to be able to get his material in a place where it had to be used. It was a very smart move. It wasn't
Yeah,
received all that well, but it worked out well
right.
because then you do um, the Coen Brothers films, and then you bowl everybody over with Barton Fink,
Right.
which gets the
Yeah.
golden reel.
Yeah. That
And and Barton Fink finally puts New York on the map with its phenomenal sound design.
yeah, that was
Up
phenomenal.
until then, we weren't really paying that much attention. And um, it's interesting that that one mixer idea changes the whole workflow. Now because of the political economy in LA, it's gone from three to two because of digital. And the political economy is what changes everything because of digital.
Yeah, we definitely have less time to do more work with more tracks. And by having two people versus three, it's obviously the division of labor is different. Having two versus one, often it's just schedule driven. I mean, we
Right.
do the bulk of television in Los Angeles, and the process is either a network show has a delivery date or a streaming show has a very tight schedule, and we need to have two people doing it. And the way we accomplish that is kind of offline mixing. So, for instance, I'm pre-dubbing dialogue through the show, kind of working my way through linearly, each scene in a linear fashion. At the same time, the effects mixer is working through the backgrounds, but on a very different part of the show. That effects mixer can be, four scenes ahead of the time. Even if we're sharing speakers or the effects mixers on headphones, we're working in a very overlapping, non-linear way. And this allows
Huh.
us to cover a lot of ground. And then what happens is once we make our passes and have worked through the show linearly, we will then start at the beginning, marry up in sync, both sharing the same speakers at the same time. I will then put in other elements such as music. They will put in elements such as Foley because they don't want to give Foley short shrift. Foley has a very important role not only in the domestic but in the international.
Sure.
It's is the glue that binds it together. And I know a lot of sound effects people, we love it because sometimes the effect itself isn't enough. It's not organic enough. It needs that connective tissue,
Sure.
that organic material, and that's what Foley does, along with effects. Sometimes alone, it's the better choice. Sometimes with it, the two together can be working in different aspects, different frequency ranges, different dynamics. That's what makes it sound very organic. It's the marriage of the material.
I love Foley and effects married. And when I
Hmm.
wrote the Foley Grail,
Hmm.
I wrote about how Foley can be single or effects can be single or they can be married. And I love it when you marry them because of the different pitches. I call it pitches, just, and you know, as a musician, we think in terms of pitches.
Absolutely.
You think in terms of frequencies as a mixer, but I think as a musician, I'm always thinking in terms of pitches.
I
And
actually do.
so,
Too. I hear dialogue and Foley and all the elements in pitches. So when I notch
yes,
noise, I'm immediately hearing it in my head, going right to it because I hear it vibrating as a pitch. You're right.
right.
And that's what I think is that part of that perfect blend is you're covering different pitches, just different elements. But yes, our workflow has changed. Having tools that are, I used to have, kind of a purpose-built notch filter. It was one device, very expensive. It was $2,000 back in the day, and it only dealt with one mono channel of notching out offending frequencies. Now
Right.
I can take a plugin that's $50 and put it across as many channels as I want. So the technology has been very democratizing and powerful. But again, they're just tools, not meant to overtake human decision. We have now new tools using artificial intelligence and large language modeling learning, using a neural network of kind of examples of this is what noise is, this is what intended sound is. And you can kind of train some of these new tools to do noise reduction in a very different way that's more transparent. But again, in the right hands, used judiciously. These are just tools. They're not
When you
meant.
were in Southeast Asia, where were you?
I was in Jakarta initially, Jakarta, Indonesia, and then Bangkok, Thailand,
And how
and
long were you gone?
2 weeks.
Gosh, just how awful it must have been to be able to go away for 2 weeks.
On Netflix's time.
You
No, they
know,
were very generous and gracious, and yes, we did a little bit of sightseeing, but a lot of it was also presentations and trips, field trips to the various facilities, listening to what they had done and giving constructive feedback, as well as talking about workflows. How is their workflow different than ours? How do we help them achieve dialogue intelligibility? It's stylistic, it's acoustic, some of it, believe it or not,
so were you
and it's a
helping them, or was it flows both ways?
I was helping them. They picked me because they singled out Ozark as an example of very intelligible dialogue. Now, that happens for a variety of reasons. It's very well recorded, so the production sound mixer did an exemplary job of capturing it, and then me giving it the proper attention that it deserves, so that while we have very rich backgrounds selling the Ozarks, as a character, Nick Forshager and crew created some wonderful backgrounds, and the music is terrific.
Yes.
That is almost like another character, but I always protected the dialogue, and they wanted to reach out to the mixer that had done that, and they contacted me, and I said, "Yeah, tell me what you're thinking," and I put together a presentation and gave examples of my process, literally looking at my mix template that was used during the show, my session, Pro Tools session, opened it up and played it through their speakers. This is what I do and why.
So were they fluent enough in English so that you could actually be very fluid in the way you were talking about it, or did they require translation?
A little bit of both. Most of them were, especially the younger people, were very fluent. The ones that weren't, I had an earpiece and we had an interpreter, two interpreters,
Fascinating.
but they understood enough with hand gesticulations and gestures and
Ah,
and languaging and a little slight delay. We all were saying the same thing. Humor translated well, believe it or not. So no, it was good. It was a very effective thing, and I was one part of that. There was um, a production sound component to that, as well as even wireless technology. We had a representative from Shure, so we covered all the angles. The acquisition of sound, so both the technology aspect of it and production sound, as well as what I covered, which was post-production sound. And it was very,
I
very helpful.
think that it's so wonderful that you did that, Larry. What a great thing to have done. And who knows what that will lead to, but what a great thing to be able to do that. There is there is an academic at the University of Chicago, whose last name is Appadurai, and he had a theory about, it's an anthropological theory about flows. It's called flows, and I cite it in this theoretical article I wrote for an academic book about my theory in ethnography, about the way I approach interviewing people for the things I write in industrial ethnography, in the way that I write when I interview people as someone who is a practitioner and a scholar, writing about something I know, but then reflecting back as someone writing about it. I don't want to get too technical, but I talk about him a bit in this thing coming out in the first handbook about sound design, where I write about Foley. And I talk about a Potterai. And the reason I do is because I say he talks about this idea of media industries, and that America isn't just influencing the world, but that there's a flows thing coming around because of globalism, where everybody is influencing each other because of globalism in media, with the flows going back and forth. So it's a theory from this Indian um, PhD at the University of Chicago, whose name is Appadurai, and he talks about flows. And I use this concept of his about the media industry's flows going back and forth through all of these countries, and I apply it to the way that we influence each other in sound. And I talk about Foley, and I talk about it. And I mean, would you believe when I'm doing Foley over at Laser Pacific that this is what we're talking about? But you and I are doing this. We're influencing and we're going back and forth and we're talking with people in other countries about sound. And we are learning and teaching from each other and influencing from these global flows from sound and learning. And
Yes.
who would have thought? But this is what is happening now. And I find it fascinating.
It is fascinating, and I realized that as different as the cultures were, and I got to learn about, things like obviously the architecture, the belief systems, the food, all the things the obvious things. As different as that was, we had a lot of commonality in terms of what we do. Many of the same tools, many of the same processes, while they're more like New York than Los Angeles in terms of a one mixer approach. Another big difference was the director. The director's role in both, certainly we know the director is very involved in feature films. In television, a director is a hired hand. They're gone after they're cut,
Yes.
moving on to the next project. That is not how it is in Southeast Asia. The director becomes the filmmaker, the showrunner. We have showrunners that are producers. There, the director really does have the voice, and the staff, the mixing staff, has to push back gently, and what they usually do is blame Netflix's spec for kind of putting the brakes on and the guardrails for we can't take this any louder than we would like or that you would like. But they really have wonderful tools over there. The facilities are great. The processes are very modernized. The techniques that they're using are very similar to us. It's just, for me, they could learn a different workflow. They could learn why is it that I'm protecting dialogue? Because it's not only just my process of physical mixing, like what plugin and what settings and how much compression, how light is the de-essing, all that stuff. Those things, we can talk about that, but it's more philosophical in that I am a very gentle, protective person of the dialogue, and I will say the score can be used to emotionally communicate what we want, but shouldn't overtake. And in
Right.
many of the examples that I was given to watch, music and effects overtook the dialogue in some instances. Some instances it wasn't a mix, it was more of an overuse of noise reduction. So we talked about backing off that and having it sound more natural, and I gave a lot of real-time examples. So it's just philosophical differences, but the tools and the techniques were actually somewhat similar.
I don't know if you have watched the series Manhunt.
I have not seen Manhunt.
Okay, well, I'm watching it now, and it's about the assassination of Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, and um, it's the Foley on it is quite beautiful. I want to talk to the people who did it, but the score, the dialogue on it is wonderful.
Hmm.
Score. I'm very sensitive to music, and I have very strong opinions about what I like in a score. It's a very understated, really interesting use of score.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think of I think it's Bryce, and he uses like cello and really interesting, like a banjo and then a cello and really vacant kind of scoring, really interesting scoring, very effective. I urge you to watch this series, Manhunt.
Hmm.
It's a series that streams once a week,
I'll
and
check it out. I like what you're talking about. That's that kind of sparseness of the score
very
where,
sparse, and it's very much of he uses instrumentation that you would hear in that era,
right.
very vacant, and it comes in and out. Very effective.
That's powerful. I will give you an example. One of the showrunners and creators I work with is Vince Gilligan. I didn't do Breaking Bad, but I did do Better Call Saul, and we're going to do his new show that will be next year. He has a score that has more import to it because it is more sparse. And one of the few shows, or only show that I know of, that actually does an editorial cut without temp music. The cut has to stand alone on its own, has to
Mm,
stand alone without any. not that it's a crutch, but any use of temp music. If it stands on its own, then they can pick and choose the moments they want to put the score. It will have more import, more meaning. But the story, the performances, the pacing, all of those aspects of storytelling have to stand on their own without the use of music. And that's how cuts are turned in with those guys.
One of the things I always enjoyed, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you, is I recall so fondly the conversations we had in between.
Yeah.
And I knew what a thinker you were and how smart you were. And it was such a pleasure just to, in between, in the hallway, and you know the hallway,
Hmm.
with the coffee or in between, it was such a pleasure talking to you because you were so darn smart and such a joy.
You're very
And
sweet.
Ethan was so smart and such a good person to work for,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
Ed Fassel, and those were good years. I
Yeah.
think I was there 3 years, good years,
Yep.
and it was always so much fun running into you in the hallway and talking with you. You were so smart, such an articulate man. Um,
Thank
Everybody, I have to tell you, Larry Benjamin is really one of the joys of sound in Hollywood, and this is just a pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's been such a joy for me too. I really enjoy conversing with you and exchanging ideas. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.